The train didn't so much arrive in Redstone, Wyoming, as it surrendered to it. It wheezed into the station on a gray November afternoon in 1882, bleeding steam from every joint, its whistle a hoarse and exhausted sound that barely carried above the wind coming down from the mountains. The mountains themselves were already white at their peaks, and the sky between them had that shade of iron that men who'd lived in the West long enough knew to read like a warning. Not a warning about anything specific, just a warning. The West was generous with those. May Calloway stepped off onto the platform with a battered leather valise in one hand and a folded letter in the other. She was 26 years old. She had dark hair that had come mostly loose from its pins during 3 days of travel, a blue calico dress that had seen better weeks, and a stillness in her face that comes not from peace, but from having already used up all available fear somewhere back around Kansas City. Not calm, not resigned, just emptied of the thing that makes people hesitate. She stood on the platform and looked at Redstone. Redstone looked back at her, the way a town looks at a woman traveling alone with curiosity. It doesn't bother to disguise in judgment. It doesn't bother to soften. The buildings along Main Street leaned into each other like tired men at the end of a long shift. The livery stable exhaled hay and horse. The saloon, already lit from within despite the fading afternoon, exhaled something warmer and less wholesome. A dog investigated the underside of a bench with great professional seriousness. The platform cleared within minutes. Families found each other. Men hauled freight. And May stood where she had stepped off the train, alone, watching the last of the other passengers disappear into the gray afternoon, each of them moving towards something specific, a name, a face, a destination that had been arranged before they left home. She had arranged something too. But it appeared the arrangement had not been mutual. She opened the letter again. She had read it so many times the fold lines were beginning to split, but she read it again anyway. Her eyes moving over the careful handwriting she had memorized months ago in a boarding house room in Boston. The name, the address, the promise of a new life in a new place with a man she had never met because the life she'd had in Boston had ended with her father's death, and the sale of everything he'd owned to cover debts she hadn't known existed until the lawyers arrived with their careful apologetic faces and their very precise accounting of what was owed. The letter said someone would meet her. No one had. She folded it back into her pocket, picked up her valise, and walked into Redstone. Main Street was a single strip of sun-bleached buildings that leaned into each other like tired men at the end of a long day. There was a general store, a livery stable, a hotel with a sign missing, 2 letters, a saloon already lit from within. Even in the fading afternoon, a seamstress's shop, and a handful of other establishments that May cataloged quickly and methodically, because that was what she did. She had always been good at taking stock of a situation, even when the situation was bleak. The situation was bleak. She went to the hotel first. The man behind the desk looked at her. Valise looked at her travel-stained dress, looked at the letter she produced as explanation, and shook his head before she'd finished speaking. The rooms were full. They were always full this time of year. He was sorry for her trouble. He did not look sorry. She tried the boarding house on the 2nd Street, a tall, narrow building with a woman named Mrs. Albright, who had sharp eyes and the expression of someone who had been disappointed by people so many times she'd simply stopped expecting otherwise. Mrs. Albright wanted $2 a week up front, no exceptions, no negotiations, no stories. May had 47 cents. She knew this because she'd counted it that morning on the train, moving the coins from one palm to the other in the gray light coming through the window, trying to make them add up to something different than they did. They added up to 47 cents. They did not add up to $2. She tried the general store, asking if they needed help. The owner, a thin man with a sandy mustache, said he had his wife and his daughter and didn't need anyone else. He said it kindly enough, but kindness doesn't change the answer. She tried the seamstress, who already had 2 girls working for her and no room for a third. She tried the saloon, which was a measure of how desperate she'd already become. The bartender laughed, not cruelly, just the laugh of a man who found the universe occasionally absurd, and suggested she try the livery. The livery owner said it wasn't work for a woman. May did not tell him that she was well past caring what kind of work it was. She thanked him and walked back out into the November wind, which had sharpened since she'd arrived, and now carried something worse underneath it, something that smelled like what it was, a long winter arriving ahead of schedule. That was the first day. The second day was the same, only colder. She slept the first night in a corner of the train station because the station master was a man of 60 with grown daughters of his own, and he looked at her and made a decision without being asked. He didn't offer her a bed, he didn't have one to offer, but he left the station unlocked, and there was a stove in the corner and a bench along the wall, and he made no comment about any of it when he came in the next morning and found her already awake, already composed, already waiting for the day to begin, as though she'd spent the night in reasonable comfort. On the second day, she went further. She knocked on doors she had no business knocking on. She offered to cook, to clean, to mend, to do laundry, to do anything at all. The answer was the same everywhere, not always unkind, but always the same. Redstone was a small town with a hard winter coming, and charity was a luxury most of its people couldn't afford to extend to strangers. It wasn't cruelty, it was arithmetic. She asked about the name in her letter. She mentioned it quietly, carefully, not wanting to make trouble, just needing to understand why every door seemed to close before she finished her sentence. The reactions were interesting, not what she'd expected. People went a little still when she said the name, the way people go still when a conversation moves on to ground they'd rather avoid. One woman at the dry goods counter suddenly found something urgent to attend to at the far end of the store. A man coming out of the barbershop glanced at the letter she was holding, glanced at her face, and said in a voice pitched low enough that no one else could hear, "You'd best let that alone, miss." She didn't understand. Not yet. On the third day, with 47 cents and nowhere to sleep and nothing left to lose, she went to find out. The address in the letter led her to the east end of town, to a house that was larger than most and better maintained, with white paint that had been recently refreshed and curtains in the windows that spoke of money and the inclination to display it. May stood at the gate for a moment looking at the house, then opened the gate and walked up to the door and knocked. The woman who answered was perhaps 55 years old, with silver hair drawn back so severely it seemed to pull her features taut, and dark eyes that took in May's entire situation, the valise, the worn dress, the letter in her hand, in approximately 2 seconds, and drew conclusions that she kept behind a face as composed and unreadable as courthouse stone. "Mrs. Nell Vane," May said. "I am." The woman's voice was precise, controlled, so the voice of someone who had decided long ago that emotion was a currency best hoarded. May held out the letter. "I'm May Calloway. I've come from Boston in response to this correspondence. I was to meet, come inside." It wasn't an invitation. It was a directive. May followed her in. The parlor was exactly as the exterior had suggested, expensive, carefully arranged, every object in it, announcing a status that its owner had not been born into and would not allow anyone to forget she had achieved. Nell Vane sat in a high-backed chair and folded her hands in her lap and looked at May the way you look at a problem you've been hoping would solve itself and hasn't. "The letter," she said. May handed it over. Nell read it without any change in expression. Then she set it on the table beside her chair and looked at May again. "Miss Calloway," she said, "I don't know who sent you that letter or who signed that name, but I can tell you it wasn't anyone in this household. No one in this family has engaged with any matrimonial agency. Whoever corresponded with you used this address and this family's name without our knowledge or consent." The room was very quiet. Outside, the November wind found a gap somewhere and made a thin, persistent sound, the sound of something looking for a way in. "You're saying," May said, and her voice came out steadier than she would have thought possible, "that the letter is false." "I'm saying," Nell Vane replied, "that whoever sent it has defrauded you, and that there is nothing here for you." She picked up the letter from the table and held it back out to May with the finality of a judge returning an exhibit. "I'm sorry for your trouble," she said, and perhaps she was in the way that people are sorry for misfortunes that are entirely someone else's problem. May took the letter. She stood up. She said, "Thank you for your time," because her mother had raised her to say thank you even when there was nothing to be thankful for, and then she walked back through the immaculate parlor and out through the immaculate front door and down the steps and through the gate, and she walked 3 blocks before she stopped. She stood still on the side of a dirt street in a town that did not want her holding a letter that had cost her everything and was worth nothing. She was 26 years old. She had 47 cents. She had nowhere to sleep tonight, nowhere to go tomorrow, and no one in the world who was looking for her. She stood there while the afternoon died around her. She watched the light go gold and then amber, and then the deep orange that the West does better than anywhere else on earth, as if the sky is trying to compensate for how hard everything else is out here. She watched it fade. She watched the first lamps come on in the windows of the buildings along Main Street, warm yellow rectangles against the growing dark, each one representing warmth and belonging that was not hers. She had cried twice since her father's funeral. Once on the train from Boston in the space between one sleeping car and the next, when she thought no one could hear. Once in the train station 3 days ago for about 45 seconds before she stopped herself and picked up her valise and walked out. She did not cry now. She was somewhere past crying in the particular territory that lies on the other side of it, a flat, still landscape where everything is very clear and very simple because all the complicated things have already happened and there is nothing left but the immediate present and what you're going to do with it. She was going to do something. She just didn't know what yet. And then the street went quiet. It happened gradually and then all at once. The two men talking outside the hardware store stopped talking mid-sentence and stepped back through the doorway. The woman crossing toward the milliners changed direction without appearing to notice she'd done it. The boys throwing a coin against the wall of the barber shop picked up their coin and were gone. The saloon's noise, the music, the laughter, the warm roar of men in a lit room dropped to a murmur, and then to something that wasn't quite silence, but was in the same neighborhood. May looked up. A man was riding into Redstone from the north end of Main Street on a horse the color of winter smoke. Even from 40 yards away, even in the failing light, there was something about the way he sat that your eye went to and stayed on. Not because he was doing anything dramatic. He was doing nothing at all, just riding at an unhurried pace down the center of the street, the horse's hooves striking the hard earth in a rhythm that was the only sound left in the world. The stillness came from him or went toward him the way a storm has a center that is different from everything around it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders. He wore a long duster coat the color of dust and a black hat pulled low against the last of the afternoon light. His hands held the reins loosely the way a man holds the reins when the horse already knows the way, and both of them know it. Cole Reston. The voice behind May was barely above a breath. Someone who had stepped into a doorway. "Lord Almighty, what's he doing back?" "Keep your head down," said another voice from somewhere to her left. "Don't catch his eye." May turned slightly. She could see the faces of the people who had retreated, watching from doorways, from the edges of windows, from the deep shadows between buildings, watching with the concentrated attention of people observing something that might become dangerous at any moment, wanting to see it, while also very much not wanting to be seen near it. She turned back to the man on the gray horse. He was 20 yards away now. She could make out more of him, the hard line of a jaw, the dark suggestion of several days' growth of beard, a scar that caught the lamplight from the saloon windows and traced a line through his left eyebrow. His eyes moved over the street in a way that seemed almost lazy, and probably wasn't the way a man looks at a room when he's already noted every exit and every potential problem and is now just confirming his earlier read. His eyes reached May. She was standing in the middle of the boardwalk, not having retreated anywhere because she hadn't thought to, and because she was no longer sure she had the energy to be afraid of one more thing today. He looked at her with the same steady assessment he'd given everything else on the street, neither more nor less, and something in that equivalence, that total lack of the particular interest or contempt that men usually directed at women in her situation, made her make the decision she made. Not bravery. She would be honest with herself about that for the rest of her life. It was not bravery. Brave implies there is something to lose. She had 47 cents in a worthless letter and nowhere to sleep, and the night coming in fast from the mountains, and what she had run entirely out of was the kind of fear that requires something worth protecting to sustain itself. She stepped off the sidewalk and into the street. The gray horse stopped the moment she moved into his path, stopped clean and immediate, not shying, not startling, just stopping because his rider's hand had gone still on the reins in the same instant. Cole Reston looked down at her from the saddle with an expression that was not anger and was not surprise and was not amusement, but was something quieter and more careful than any of those things. "You need to move, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough-edged, the voice of a man who didn't talk unless he had something to say. It carried in the silence the way only certain voices carry, not by being loud, but by being exactly what they were. "I need work," May said. She heard the sound from the doorways and windows around her, a sharp collective breath, the sound of people not believing what they were seeing. "I'll do anything," she continued. because she decided to say this and she was going to say it. Cook, clean, mend, tend animals. I learn quickly, and I don't complain, and I don't steal. Cole Reston looked at her for a long moment without speaking. He had the eyes of a man who has spent a long time in high country, pale gray, almost silver, the color of the sky above the tree line in winter. Not cold exactly, more like clear, like water over stone, like something that has had the impurities worked out of it by years of being exactly what it is and nothing else. You're from back east, he said. Not a question. Boston. I came west as a mail order bride. The arrangement turned out to be fraudulent. She said it simply without self-pity the way you state a fact about the weather. I have 47 cents and nowhere to sleep tonight. I have asked everyone in this town for work. Every one of them said no. She paused. You're the last person I haven't asked. He said nothing for a long moment. The horse shifted its weight with a soft sound, and Cole Reston settled it with a pressure of his knee that May could barely see. You know who I am, he said, again not a question. I know what they called you from the doorways, May said. Cole Reston. I don't know what it means yet. It means, he said, that you'd be wise to find somewhere else to direct your request. I've explained that the options for somewhere else are currently limited. Something happened in his face then. Not quite a change, more like a door very briefly, and almost imperceptibly opened a fraction. And then it closed again, or nearly closed, the way you close a door against a draft without latching it, not quite shut. He looked past her at the watching town, the eyes in the doorways, the shadows in the windows, and his expression in that moment, what May could read of it, was not what she expected. Not satisfaction, not the ugly pleasure some men take in being feared. Something quieter and less easy to name. Something that understood without forgiving and had long since stopped hoping for anything different. He looked back down at her. I've got a cabin 2 hours north of here, he said. His voice dropped, further pitched now for only her. Isolated, no neighbors within riding distance. The work is real cooking, cleaning the chickens, the garden come spring, whatever else needs doing. I don't pay wages, but you'd have food and a roof and no one to bother you. May held his gaze. Those are the terms. One more. Out here, an unmarried man and woman sharing a roof causes a kind of talk that follows a woman the rest of her life, whether she stays or goes. He said it straight, no apology in it, just the fact. You'd carry my name as my wife. In name only, that part I give you my word on, and I keep my word. It's protection, not obligation. The street was as quiet as a held breath. May thought about tonight, about the train station and the cold. About 47 cents and morning coming, and nothing changed. She thought about the options that remained to her, and she laid them out in her mind, the way she laid out those coins methodically without flinching one next to the other. She thought about the pale eyes of a man who had just made her an offer that was strange and hard and potentially the most dangerous thing she'd ever done, and who had not once looked at her the way that men in desperate negotiations sometimes look at women in desperate situations. All right, she said. Cole Reston nodded once. Get your things. 5 minutes. He rode to the general store at the end of the street. May picked up her valise, which she'd set down somewhere in the middle of the conversation without noticing, and followed. In the store, he moved quickly through the aisles, flour coffee, salt-dried beans, ammunition, stacking things on the counter, with the efficiency of a man who knew what he needed and had no interest in browsing. The storekeeper, a young man named Warren, whose hands trembled slightly when he totaled the purchase, kept his eyes carefully neutral in the way that people keep their eyes when they are trying very hard not to think something they're already thinking. Cole counted out bills without being told the total, and then paused, glanced at May, standing near the door, and went back through the aisles. He returned with a bar of good soap, a small paper package of hairpins, and a length of cotton fabric in a soft gray that was almost blue. He set them on the counter. For the lady, he said to Warren, not to May. Warren wrapped everything without comment. May stood very still and did not examine what she felt about a man she'd known for 15 minutes, buying her soap and hairpins without being asked in the same tone of voice he used for ammunition. She filed it away. She would look at it later when she had time to look at things. They rode north out of Redstone in the full dark May, sitting behind Cole on the gray horse which was named Smoke, though she wouldn't learn that until later. The town watched them go from its windows and its doorways, and May did not look back. There was nothing behind her worth looking at. Whatever came next was ahead of her in the dark, and she would deal with what when she got there. 2 hours in the dark, and the world changed around them and as they rode. The flat emptiness of the territory gave way to rolling country covered in scrub pine and juniper, a creek appearing to their right and running fast over stones, the air sharpening into something that cut cleaner and smelled of resin and cold water and distance from everything human. The stars came out above the tree line, dense and bright, the way they only get when there are no lights below to argue with them. Cole didn't speak. May didn't speak. The horse's hooves found the path without hesitation, and somewhere in the second hour, despite everything, despite the strangeness of all of it, despite the reasonable certainty that she should be afraid, May's head drooped forward until her forehead rested against the broad back of the man in front of her. She could feel him breathing, steady and even and calm, the breathing of someone who had long ago made peace with whatever the night might bring. She had not felt safe in a long time. Months, maybe longer. She didn't examine it closely. She just let herself feel it briefly in the dark, the way you let yourself feel warmth when you step out of the cold, not questioning it, just receiving it. Almost there, Cole said. She lifted her head. The cabin appeared in a small clearing head, small, solidly built of dark logs, a stone chimney, a covered porch. Behind it, the shapes of a lean-to stable and what might be a chicken coop. Even in the darkness, May could see that it was carefully maintained, the kind of care that means something to its keeper. Not the grudging maintenance of someone preventing collapse, but the active care of someone who believes the thing is worth keeping. Cole helped her down from the saddle with hands that were impersonal and steady and asked nothing. Her legs nearly gave out when she touched the ground. 2 hours on horseback after 3 days of walking had taken the last of whatever reserve she'd been running on. He held her elbow until she found her balance, then led the horse to the stable without comment, without drawing attention to what had just happened, which was its own kind of courtesy. May stood in the yard and looked at the cabin. The clouds had moved off the moon while they rode, and the light was silver and clean on the log walls, on the porch railing, on the roof that had no missing shingles and had been reshingled recently by someone who took the work seriously. Cole came back and opened the cabin door and lit a lantern, and the light spread out warm and amber, and May stepped inside. She stopped. The cabin was one main room and a kitchen area, small, but beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when every object in them has been chosen with care and lived with over years until it becomes part of the whole. A stone fireplace along one wall with a worn armchair beside it, positioned exactly right for the light and the warmth. A sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center. Shelves along the kitchen wall with dishes arranged neatly and pots hanging in order of size. A quilt on the bed with a pattern May didn't recognize, but which had been made by someone who knew what they were doing and had taken the time to do it right. And the small things. A basket of sewing near the armchair. Recipe cards in careful handwriting tucked into the edge of a shelf. Curtains on the windows, simple, cleanly hemmed, the same gray-blue as the fabric Cole had just bought her. A rag rug on the floor woven with real craft. This had been a woman's home, and it had been loved. My mother's, Cole said from the doorway, reading something in her stillness. She passed 2 years ago. I've kept it as she had it. May nodded and said nothing because there was nothing to say to that kind of grief that doesn't make it smaller. He showed her the back bedroom, barely bigger than a closet, but with a narrow bed and a thick quilt and a window that looked out toward the creek. He said he'd sleep in the lean-to with the horse. She started to say he didn't have to, and he cut it off before she'd finished. Deal was you get the house, he said. I'm a man of my word. He built a fire in the hearth with practiced efficiency, showed her where the food stores were kept, told her briefly and precisely what she needed to know about the well and the outhouse and the firewood, and then walked to the door. May, she said, because she'd realized they'd talked for over an hour, and she hadn't told him her name. He paused, hand on the doorframe. My name, she said. I don't think I told you. May Calloway. I know, he said, and then before she could ask how, get some sleep. We start early. The door closed quietly behind him. She should have spent the night cataloging her fears. There were plenty available. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she didn't know in a country she didn't know, with no way back to civilization if she'd read him wrong. Every sensible thing she'd been taught argued for terror. Instead, she unpacked her valise, which took approximately 3 minutes because she didn't own much. She put her spare dress on a hook. She set her mother's wedding ring. The one thing she hadn't sold, the one thing the lawyers couldn't take on the small shelf beside the bed. She washed her face with water from the pitcher someone had left on the dresser, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the fire settle, and the creek run, and the distant sound of coal moving in the lean-to, settling the horse, and then the quieting that meant he'd bedded down. She reached for the small oil lamp on the bedside table to put it out, and in doing so she pulled the drawer open without meaning to. Inside the drawer was a wooden box. She almost closed the drawer. Almost. Then she opened the box. Inside were letters, perhaps 20 of them folded carefully bound together, written in the same hand on paper that had been good once and had aged to the color of old ivory. The handwriting was clear and deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship seriously and never saw a reason to stop trying. May picked up the top letter. She would tell herself later that she hadn't meant to read it, had only looked at the address, but that wasn't entirely honest. She read it. It was addressed to a matrimonial agency in Boston, and it began, "I am writing on behalf of my son, who will not write for himself because he does not believe he deserves what I am asking for on his behalf. He is 32 years old, he stands over 6 feet tall, and works harder than any man I have ever known. He has his father's hands and his grandfather's stubbornness in my eyes, though I have never told him that. He has spent too many years alone, and the reasons for that are not his fault, though he has convinced himself they are." May sat very still. She read on. "I have reviewed your agency's correspondence for several months now. I am looking for a specific kind of woman, not a woman who wants to be saved, but a woman who already knows how to save herself and is simply looking for ground solid enough to stand on. I believe I have found her in Miss May Calloway of Boston. Her letters suggest someone who is not frightened of difficulty, who pays attention to the world around her, and who has the kind of honesty that is more valuable than beauty and more rare than either. I do not know if my son will accept this. He will not at first. He will say he doesn't need help and that he's fine and that he prefers things as they are. He has been saying these things for years and they have not yet become true. I am including this note in the drawer of the room where I hope she'll sleep, because by the time anyone reads it, I may not be here to say it aloud. If my son is reading this, Cole, you deserve this. You have always deserved more than what the world has been willing to give you. Let her in. If Miss Calloway is reading this, welcome child. I chose you carefully. I am sorry I couldn't be here to meet you. Yours in hope, Eliza Reston." The letter was dated March 1880, 2 years before May had received the agency's correspondence, 2 years before Cole's mother had died, 2 years before May had packed everything she owned into a battered valise and stepped onto a train heading west. May sat in the small room in the cabin in the Wyoming dark and held the letter in her hands and understood 3 things simultaneously. She had not come here because of a con man's fraud. She had not come here by accident. She had been chosen carefully and deliberately by a woman who had studied her through letters for months and decided she was the right person for the most important decision left to make. That woman had placed this letter in the drawer of this room and then died before her son knew any of it, before anything could be explained or protested or refused. The fraud, whoever had intercepted the agency's correspondence to run their scheme, had not known that one of the letters was real, that the woman they were impersonating had already done exactly what they were pretending to do. Cole Reston did not know his mother had done this. May sat with that for a long time. The fire popped in the hearth in the next room. The creek ran its constant course outside the window. The mountains stood where they always stood, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the silver moonlight. She put the letter carefully back in the box. She put the box back in the drawer. She turned out the lamp. She lay down on the narrow bed and pulled the quilt up around her and stared at the rafters above her in the dark. She had come here with 47 cents and a false promise and nothing else. She had come here without hope. But somewhere in this cabin, in the careful handwriting of a woman she would never meet, was a letter that said, "I chose you carefully, May Calloway." 26 years old, alone in the wilderness with a man whose name made a whole town go silent, closed her eyes. For the first time in longer than she could calculate, she did not go to sleep afraid. She went to sleep thinking I was chosen. And outside in the lean-to, the man who didn't know any of this let the night settle around him, and the last lantern light in the clearing went dark, and the stars over Redstone, Wyoming were very bright and very far away, and absolutely indifferent to the small, impossible thing that was beginning without either of its participants quite knowing it yet, in the one-room log cabin that a woman named Eliza Reston had filled with careful love and deliberate hope and left behind like a letter to the future. Winter came to the Wyoming high country the way it always came, not announcing itself, not apologizing, just arriving one morning as a fact that had always been true and that you were expected to deal with. It came in the temperature of the air, and the angle of the light, and the way the ground hardened underfoot. And if you'd been paying attention, which May had been learning to do, you had seen it coming for a week before it arrived. She woke on her fourth morning in the cabin to find frost on the inside of the window glass, a fire already burning in the hearth, and a pot of coffee warming on the iron stove. Cole was outside. She could hear the axe, that steady rhythmic sound that would become as familiar to her over the coming weeks as her own heartbeat. She lay still for a moment in the narrow bed listening to it and thought about the letter in the drawer. She had not mentioned it. She was not sure when the right time would be or whether there was one. She only knew it wasn't yet. She got up. She made breakfast. She burned the biscuits the first time, and the second time got them almost right. And when Cole came in from outside with his arms full of wood and looked at the plate she set in front of him, he looked at it for a moment and then sat down and ate without comment. He had two helpings. That was how she knew the biscuits were good enough. They worked out the shape of their days without discussing it, the way people work out the arrangements of a shared space, not through negotiation, but through the gradual accumulation of small adjustments. Each one so minor it barely registered, until one morning you wake up and the whole system has organized itself, and everyone knows their part in it without anyone having said so. Cole was outside before first light. He chopped wood, checked the property line, tended smoke in the lean-to stable, assessed whatever the night had left behind, tracks in the fresh snow, a fence post that needed resetting, the small continuous maintenance of a life built in a place that would dismantle itself if you stopped paying attention. He came in for breakfast. He went back out. He came in for supper. Sometimes he sat by the fire for an hour before heading back to the lean-to, and during that hour he might sharpen a knife or mend a piece of harness or simply sit and look at the fire with an expression that asked for nothing from the world and had long since stopped expecting it. May cleaned. She cooked. She made herself useful in every way she could identify and looked for more. She moved the recipe box to the counter nearest the stove because that was where it made sense. She organized the shelves so that the things used daily were at eye level. She rehung the ladle in the largest skillet so they were reachable without stretching. Small changes, each one logical, none of them dramatic. Cole never commented on any of it, but she noticed the way he came in some evenings and paused briefly in the doorway, taking in the room before he crossed to the table. She noticed the pause. She couldn't read what was in it, whether it was approval or something more complex. The discomfort of seeing a place you've preserved out of grief slowly becomes something else, something present rather than past. She let it alone. She had learned early that Cole Reston was a man who would say what he had to say when he was ready to say it, and that pushing served no purpose except to make him quieter. He taught her things. This was not soft or sentimental. It was practical and direct, and sometimes exasperating the way all genuine instruction is. He showed her the chickens the second morning, a dozen of them, with the territorial confidence of creatures who know they are essential and have decided to make you prove you know it too. He told her to move with certainty and they would respect it. She moved with what she believed was certainty. The largest hen, a red bird, with the disposition of a circuit court judge, pecked her hand hard enough to leave a mark. Again, Cole said. She tried again. She was pecked again less hard. Better, he said. By the end of the first week, she could collect eggs from all 12 boxes without losing blood. She wasn't sure she had ever been prouder of anything. He taught her the well, how to draw water without destroying your back, how to check the rope for fraying, how to keep the bucket from swinging. He taught her the root cellar organized in a way that made sense once he explained the logic of it. He walked her through the scrub pine at the edge of the clearing in the brittle November cold, pointing at plants, and naming them in a voice that was neither warm nor unkind, but was simply accurate. This will kill you. This won't. This one only if you eat enough of it. Her father had been a teacher, and she recognized in Cole the same qualities she'd recognized in her father, the willingness to take the question seriously, to assume the person asking deserved a real answer. One afternoon, he brought out the rifle. A Winchester lever-action blued steel and a walnut stock that had been oiled so many times it was the color of dark honey. He held it out to her across both palms the way you hand someone something that matters. "You need to know this," he said. "You're alone out here when I'm away. If something comes animal or human, you need to be able to answer it." May took the rifle. It was heavier than she'd expected. "I've never fired a gun," she said. "I know." He spent the rest of the afternoon teaching her how to hold it, how to stand, how to breathe before the trigger, and not after how to let the sight settle instead of chasing the target. He was a good teacher, patient in a way that seemed to surprise even him, as though patience was a skill he hadn't known he possessed until he needed it. He corrected her without criticism, demonstrated without condescension, waited without impatience. Her first shot went wide by 3 feet. Her sixth hit the marked tree at 30 yards. "Good," he said, and turned away before she could see if there was anything else in his face when he said it. She thought there might have been. The days accumulated. November became December. The cold deepened into something serious, the kind that turns your breath to ice before it leaves your mouth and makes the simple act of walking from the cabin to the chicken coop feel like an act of will. May's hands blistered and healed and blistered again until the skin thickened into something she didn't recognize when she looked at her own palms. Her back ached from the well rope. She collected small cuts and bruises the way you collect experience, one at a time without ceremony, and they stayed with you. But there was something else accumulating too, beneath the blisters and the aching muscles and the education and survival. She was becoming competent in a world she'd known nothing about 2 months ago, and competence has its own quiet satisfaction, solid and entirely your own. One evening she sat by the fire mending one of Cole's shirts the elbow had worn through, and the fabric around it was thin enough that if she didn't reinforce it soon, the whole sleeve would go, and Cole came in from outside earlier than usual and sat in the armchair on the other side of the hearth, and she looked up, and he was looking at the fire with the expression she was learning to read. The look of a man thinking about something he'd decided a long time ago not to think about. She didn't ask. She went back to her mending. After a long time, he said without looking away from the fire, "My mother used to sit there." May held the needle still. "In that chair," he said, "evenings, mending." She settled on the simplest thing. She loved this cabin. "She built it," Cole said. "Not alone, she had help a neighbor 40 miles east who owed my father a debt. But she designed every bit of it. She knew exactly what she needed." He was quiet for a moment. "She was the best person I've ever known. Kind without being weak. Strong without being cruel." He turned from the fire and looked at May directly, and his pale eyes were clear and undefended in a way she hadn't seen before. "I'm not those things," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not the man she was." May set down the shirt in the needle and looked back at him. "I know what I've seen," she said. "In 5 weeks. 5 weeks isn't long enough." "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but it's what I have." He turned back to the fire. The subject was closed for now, but the door was open a little further than it had been, and both of them knew it. 3 days after that evening, on a cold Monday, in the second week of December, Cole said they were going into Redstone. May looked up from the bread she was shaping. "Why supplies? And because people need to see you." He was checking the load in his rifle without looking at her. "Need to know you're real, that you're my wife. That coming near you means answering to me." She understood. She had understood since the night they'd made the arrangement standing in the dark street with the whole town watching from its shadows. But understanding something and doing it are different territories. She put on the gray-blue dress she'd sewn from the fabric he'd bought that first night. She pinned her hair up carefully the way her mother had taught her and looked at herself in the small mirror over the washstand. The woman looking back at her was not the same woman who had stepped off the train 6 weeks ago. Her hands were different. Her face was different. Something in the eyes, the set of the jaw. Something settled. The ride to Redstone took 2 hours. They rode with the mountains behind them and the flat winter sky ahead, and the cold kept conversation to a minimum, which suited them both. May sat behind Cole on Smoke, her arms around his waist, and the horse moved with his usual smooth certainty through a world that was very white and very quiet. Redstone looked the same. It always would look the same. She thought that combination of weather-beaten ambition and weather-beaten resignation, That was the authentic face of a Western town in 1882. They rode down Main Street, and the town responded exactly as it had the first night she'd seen it respond to Cole Reston. A ripple of attention, a stilling of activity, a watchfulness that was not quite respect and not quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. The difference now was that the attention moved between Cole and May, back and forth like a pendulum, trying to calculate something it hadn't expected to have to account for. A woman on Cole's horse. A woman wearing a plain gold band, thin and unadorned, that Cole had produced from his pocket one morning 3 weeks ago and placed on her finger with the ceremony of someone completing a logistical task. It fit. She hadn't asked how. She thought she might know. It was going reasonably well until Nell Vane stepped out of the dry goods store. She stopped on the boardwalk, and her dark eyes moved from Cole to May and then back to Cole, and the composed face that May had read as self-possession in the parlor of the Vane house was doing something different now, something tighter, barely contained the face of a woman who has had years to build the architecture of her grievance and is not inclined to let it stand empty. Cole Reston. Her voice was the same precise instrument May remembered. I see you found a way to bring your trouble back into town. Cole reined in smoke. He looked at her the way he looked at most things, straight on, without flinching, without anger either. Mrs. Vane, he said, that was all. You have some nerve. She descended the 2 steps to street level. After what you did, after everything this town knows about you. Mrs. Vane, Cole started. Don't. The word came out hard and flat. My son limped for 2 years. My son still can't. She stopped herself, gathered herself. Her eyes moved to May. And now you drag some poor girl out here to play house with you. Some girl off the train who doesn't know what you are. There was a small crowd forming. Drama was a currency in small towns. It spent fast, and everyone wanted to get there before it was gone. May felt Cole's jaw tighten. She felt it because she was close enough to see it. He wasn't going to say anything. She understood this. He had decided a long time ago not to defend himself in Redstone, and that decision had the kind of solidity in him that decisions do when they've been kept long enough to become structural. She made her own decision. She swung down from Smoke's back, a maneuver she'd practiced enough times in the past weeks to do without thinking, and she stepped forward until she was level with Nell Vane, not close enough to threaten, just close enough to be real. My name is May Reston, she said clearly and without heat. I came to Redstone 6 weeks ago with nothing. Cole gave me work and a roof and an honest arrangement. He has treated me with more respect than anyone else in this town has shown me. The crowd was very quiet. I don't know everything, May said. 6 weeks is 6 weeks. But I know what I've seen, and I know the difference between a man who does harm and a man who has had harm done to him and chosen not to pass it on. Nell Vane's face went through several colors during this speech. It settled on something complicated fury and something underneath the fury that looked for just a moment like doubt, like a nail that had been so long driven in that the hammer striking the head from the other side comes as a shock. You don't know, she said, but the precision had gone out of her voice. No, May said. I've said that, but I'm willing to learn. Are you willing to tell me the truth of it, or only the version of it you've been carrying? The crowd was absolutely still. Nell Vane's mouth pressed itself into a line. She turned and walked back into the dry goods store, and the door closed behind her with a sound that fell somewhere between a slam and a dismissal. The crowd dispersed as crowds do when the main event has concluded without the bloodshed they'd been hoping for. May turned back to Smoke and found Cole looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not gratitude exactly, though it was in the neighborhood. Something more exposed than gratitude. Something that looked like a man who has spent so long expecting nothing good from people that unexpected good lands on him like a blow. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. A hand on her arm, light and brief, a woman perhaps 28 years old with reddish-brown hair and direct green eyes, in the bearing of someone who had always worked hard and never resented it. Mrs. Reston, the woman said, I'm Hattie Briscoe. My family runs the dry goods down the other end. I wanted to say, she paused, seemed to decide that directness was the only method she trusted. What you just said needed saying about 10 years ago. I'm glad someone finally said it. May looked at her. Something in the directness of her eyes, the steadiness of her manner, was the same quality she'd recognized in herself recently when she looked in the mirror. Thank you, May said. If you ever need someone to talk to, Hattie said, or anything at all, come find me. She walked away. May watched her go. It was May realized the first genuine offer of friendship she'd received from anyone since her father died. They collected their supplies and rode home in the low winter light, the shadows of the pines long and blue across the snow. Halfway back to the cabin with the lights of Redstone, a memory behind them, Cole spoke. What she said about her son. May waited. His name is Doyle. He's 27 now. He paused. This was a man who had said certain things so rarely that saying them required construction the way a man who doesn't build things often has to think through every step before he can proceed. 10 years ago, he was 17. The horse walked on. The creek ran somewhere in the dark. May didn't move, didn't speak because she understood that this was the kind of story that requires the silence around it to have the right shape. I was 24, Cole said. I was in Redstone on a freight run. Late, the alley behind the saloon. He stopped for a moment. When he started again, his voice was the same low instrument it always was, but something underneath it had changed pitch. Doyle Vane was drunk, drunker than 17 ought to be. There was another man, an argument about something that didn't matter the way those arguments never matter. And then it wasn't an argument anymore. May was very still. The man died, Cole said. It wasn't intended, but it happened. And I was the only other person there. The mountains stood around them, enormous and indifferent. You could have told the sheriff, May said. I could have. And a 17-year-old boy would have hanged, or close enough to it. He was quiet for a moment. He had a whole life in front of him. He wasn't a bad kid. He was a scared kid who did a terrible thing and couldn't undo it. So you let them think it was you. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. There was no body found. The man was a drifter, no family asking questions. But rumors go where they go in small towns, and I was there. And Doyle wasn't, and Nell Vane needed somewhere to put what she could see was wrong with her son and couldn't explain. May thought about Nell's face on the boardwalk. The grief dressed up as fury, the wound that had been so long open it had become identity. She doesn't know, May said. Not a question. No, and Doyle has never spoken of it. He came to me once, 3 years later, and said he was sorry. I told him to live well and leave it alone. A long pause. I don't know if he has. May sat with this. 10 years of one man's silence standing between a boy's life and the gallows. 10 years of a town's contempt accepted without contest. The scar through his eyebrow, the wariness in his face, the way the whole of Redstone went quiet when he rode in all of it, carrying the same story, and the story not the one anyone in that town had told themselves. That's the most decent thing I've ever heard of, she said quietly. Cole made a sound, not quite a laugh. Most people would call it something else. Most people, May said, are wrong. He didn't respond. But something in the set of his shoulders shifted very slightly and didn't shift back. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, and it was a different silence than it had been before, warmer at its edges, like a room where someone has recently been. 4 days after the trip into Redstone, Cole rode out before first light for a 2-day hunt in the northern range, leaving May alone with the chickens, the rifle, and the quiet of a property that feels different when its main occupant is absent. Not frightening exactly, just different, more aware of its own edges. He came back on the second evening to find her at the table with a cup of tea and an expression that was composed in the specific way things are composed when they have recently been required to hold. Someone came, he said, not a question. A man named Dupree, May said. Large, well-dressed for what he is. 3 men with him. She described the conversation, the pleasant knock, the reasonable voice, the eyes that were calculating everything, while the mouth said nothing overtly threatening. The way he had looked at the cabin when he spoke, not at her inventorying. The way he had asked about Cole with the tone of a man who had an existing relationship he was choosing to characterize as casual. I told him you'd be back within the hour. He left. Cole was quiet for a long moment. He set down the rifle he'd carried in and leaned it carefully against the wall. He believed you, May said, but not because of what I said. He left because he decided the timing wasn't right. That's different. Yes, Cole said, it is. He looked at the rifle leaning against the wall by the door. Then he looked at May, and she saw the calculation moving behind his pale eyes. Not alarm, not anger, just the steady arithmetic of a man who understands how certain kinds of men think. Tomorrow morning, we work on speed. Speed, not accuracy. You've got that. Speed, how fast you can get the rifle to your shoulder, how fast you can reload, how to stand so a doorway is at your back and nothing is at his. May nodded. She had already understood from the way Dupree had turned his horse when he left, not like a man departing, but like a man choosing to return later, that tomorrow morning would not be soon enough. But tomorrow morning was what they had, so they would use it. He kept his word. They spent 2 hours in the clearing behind the cabin the next morning, the cold biting at their faces and the snow muffling the shots. And Cole worked her through every scenario he could think of with the methodical patience of someone who understood that preparation is the only honest answer to a threat you can see coming. He showed her the 2 loose boards on the back porch that made a sound like a gunshot when stepped on, information about the property delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of a man sharing practical knowledge, and she only understood later that it was information about defense, about how to know where a man was before he knew where she was. That evening he sat in the armchair longer than usual. May mended by the fire and did not ask the questions she was thinking, and eventually Cole said, "Jack Dupree runs with a loose outfit, 5 or 6 men. They watch properties in the territory, wait for the right moment. They've hit 3 homesteads in the past year that I know of." He paused. "He won't come when I'm here." "I know," May said. "If he comes when I'm not, I'll answer him," May said. It was the word Cole had used weeks ago, and she had not forgotten it. He looked at her for a moment with something she was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man who keeps encountering evidence of something he'd decided not to believe in and is running out of reasons to keep not believing it. "Yes," he said, "you will." 3 evenings later, after supper, with the fire low and the wind moving through the pines outside, May sat for a long moment looking at the bedroom door. Then she got up and went into the small room and opened the nightstand drawer. She took out the box. She carried it back to the main room and set it on the table in front of Cole. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I found it my first night," she said. "I should have told you sooner. I don't have a good reason why I didn't, except I needed time to understand what it meant before I could say it." He looked at the box without touching it. "It's letters," May said, "from your mother to a matrimonial agency in Boston." She paused. "She chose me, Cole. She wrote to the agency for months, and she read the correspondence from applicants, and she chose me, specifically and deliberately. She wrote down her reasons." She watched his face and kept her voice steady. "She died before she could tell you, but she planned all of it. The arrangement was never a fraud, not on her end. The fraud was someone intercepting the agency's correspondence and using it to run a scheme. They didn't know that one of those letters was real." Cole hadn't moved. He was looking at the box with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual now after 6 weeks of learning his face. Whatever was happening behind his eyes was too large and too private for her to name. "She arranged the whole thing," May said, "without telling you because she knew you'd say no." A sound escaped him, then not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. Barely a sound at all, but she heard it. He reached out and opened the box. He took out the first letter and unfolded it. He read it in the firelight, and May watched his hands, those scarred, calloused hands that could swing an axe all morning and hold a rifle dead still and gentle. A frightened horse, without thinking, watched them hold the paper his mother had touched, and she saw what she'd been watching for the very slight tremor barely visible at the bottom edge of the last page. He put the letter down. He picked up the next one. He read every letter in the box slowly and in order while the fire burned down to coals. May sat across the table and did not speak because there was nothing to say, and she knew it. When he finished the last one, he sat for a long time with his hands flat on the table and his eyes somewhere past the fireplace wall and beyond the cabin and probably beyond Wyoming entirely. "She never told me," he finally said. "No. She knew I'd—" "Yes." He was quiet again. The coals shifted in the grate. "She described you," May said, "in the letters, to the agency, what she was looking for. She wrote about your hands, your stubbornness, your grandfather's stubbornness," she said. May paused. "She said you'd spent too many years alone and that the reasons weren't your fault, even though you'd convinced yourself they were." Cole looked up from the table. "She also wrote about me," May continued, about why she chose me. She said she wasn't looking for a woman who wanted to be saved. She was looking for one who already knew how to save herself and just needed solid enough ground to stand on. She held his gaze. She said she chose me because my letters showed someone who paid attention to the world, who was honest, who wasn't frightened of difficulty. She said honesty was more valuable than beauty and more rare than either. The fire was nearly out. The cabin was cool and full of the presence of a woman who was no longer in it. She knew what she was doing, Cole said. His voice was rough in a different way than usual. Not the roughness of disuse, but of something larger than he had room for. She did. She picked a stranger for me. She picked carefully, May said. She told me so, in the note she left into the drawer. She wrote, she paused, then went from memory because she had read it so many times it was in her completely now, like something she'd always known. Welcome, child. I chose you carefully. I am sorry I couldn't be here to meet you. The silence after this was the longest yet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like water. The coals in the grate went from orange to red to the dim red of things going dark. Cole Reston, 34 years old, who had spent 10 years being silent and alone and carrying the weight of someone else's secret and the contempt of a town he'd never asked anything from, sat at the table his mother had built in the cabin. His mother had loved and looked at the letters his mother had written, and May watched something happen in his face that was too private to describe and too real to look away from. She saw you, May said quietly. She saw exactly who you were, and she sent for someone to come find you. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clear and direct, and the pale winter color of them was the same as always, but something behind them was different. Something that had been braced against itself for a very long time had not relaxed exactly, shifted, as though a structure under enormous pressure had found unexpectedly another wall to lean against. She always did know better than me, he said. His voice was very quiet. Seems like, May said. He picked up one of the letters again and looked at it, not reading, just holding it. After a moment, he folded it carefully and put it back in the box and closed the lid. He stood up from the table and picked up the box and carried it to the shelf beside the recipe cards, his mother's handwriting, next to his mother's handwriting, two kinds of the same love, and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he turned toward the door. Cole, May said. He paused. She didn't know entirely what she'd been going to say. There were too many things that were true and too many of them not yet ready to be said, and she was trying to locate the one that was ready right now in this moment. She was right, May said, about the solid ground. He stood very still with his back to her. I'm not leaving, May said. I want you to know that whatever comes next, I'm not leaving. A long moment, the wind in the pines, the quiet creak of the cabins settling in the cold. Get some sleep, Cole said. His voice was the roughest she'd heard it. Snow's coming. I can feel it. He went out. The door closed with its usual quiet click, neither slam nor apology. May sat alone in the cabin by the dying fire. She looked at the shelf where the box now sat the recipe cards and the letters side by side, two kinds of a woman's handwriting, two kinds of the same love. She thought about 10 years of a man's silence, about a boy named Doyle who was now 27, about a town that had built a monster and then made it as real as they could by believing in it hard enough. She thought about what Cole had said, I'm not those things. I'm not the man she was. And she thought, no, you're not her. But she was trying to tell you something about yourself that you don't know how to see. She got up and banked the coals so they'd still have heat in the morning. She checked the door to the back room. She looked briefly at the rifle leaning by the front door, which was always there now, which she could handle without thinking about it now, which 6 weeks ago had been a foreign object and was now simply an instrument she knew how to use. She thought about a woman named Eliza Reston, who had studied letters from Boston women for months, looking for something specific, and found it, and then died before she could see whether she'd been right. She was right, May thought. Then she went to bed. The snow started sometime before dawn. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to it and thought about what morning would bring, what the weeks ahead would bring, what the snow always brought, the closing in of the world, the narrowing of it to the cabin and the clearing, and the two people who moved through them together in the pattern they'd worked out without ever having discussed it. Outside in the lean-to, Cole Reston was still awake. She didn't know this for certain. But she thought so. She thought he was sitting in the dark with his horse and his mother's letters in his mind, and the quiet that he had lived in so long, it had become a kind of company, and she thought that tonight the quiet felt different to him than it had before. Different didn't mean easy. Different didn't mean fixed. But different was a beginning. And some things, the ones worth having, only ever begin once. The trick is recognizing the beginning when you're standing in it. The signs began 3 days before the flood. Cole saw them the way a man sees things when he has spent enough years in a particular landscape that its smallest deviations register before he can name what is registered. He noticed them the way you notice a wrong note in a familiar piece of music, not by thinking about it, but by the way something in you goes still and waits. The creek behind the cabin was running fast. Too fast for January, which was the month that should have slowed everything down, locked it in, held it still, and cold and predictable. The water had changed color too, that brownish cast that meant sediment coming from somewhere upstream, churned up by something that didn't belong in the frozen upper valley. He noticed the birds. Every morning for a week, the sky had been marked with movement heading south, not the usual small arrangements of birds between trees, but sustained directed flight, the kind of movement that spoke of something being left behind rather than something being traveled toward. He noticed the deer sign near the northern tree line. They had been moving south too, all of them. He stood on the porch on the morning of the third day and looked at the sky and did not like what he saw there, a yellow-gray quality to the light that was not weather, exactly more like the way light looks when something beyond the mountains is changing the conditions that produce it. He had seen this once before. He had been 16 years old and living 40 miles east, and his father had watched the same kind of sky and said nothing. And 2 days later, a wall of snowmelt came down from the upper range and took out 3 farms in the lower valley and killed 11 people. His father had known. He'd simply considered it other people's problem. Cole had considered that memory for 16 years. He had his own conclusions about it. He went inside. May was at the stove turning cornbread in the cast-iron skillet with the efficiency of someone who had learned over 3 months exactly how the stove ran hot on the left side and needed compensating. She looked up. When she heard the quality of his step, she had learned that too, the difference between his ordinary walk and the walk of a man carrying something he's working out. "Something's wrong," she said. Not a question. "The creek's wrong," he said. "The birds are wrong. I need to go up to the northern outcrop and see what I can see from there." She set the skillet down. "How long? 2 hours, maybe 3. And if it's what you think it is," he looked at her directly. 3 months of living in the same space had done something to his ability to be indirect with her. She had a way of looking at him that made evasion feel like more work than honesty. "Then I ride for Redstone and warn them," he said, "and you stay here." And Cole, "The cabin is on rock foundation," he said, 15 feet above the creek at its current level. "Whatever comes down from the mountains won't reach here. You'll be safe." He paused. "But Redstone is in the floodplain. It always has been. They built on flat land because flat land was cheap and nobody who built there thought far enough ahead." May looked at him for a long moment. She was thinking he could see when the way she thought things through carefully and fully before she spoke, which was a quality he had come to rely on without ever having said so. "And if I stay and something else comes," she said. "The rifle's loaded," he said. "You know how to use it. You know the property." He held her eyes. "I need to know you're here and safe so I can do what needs doing without splitting my attention. If I'm worried about 2 places at once, I'm not going to be fully useful to either one." This was the most he had ever said at one time about what was inside him. They both understood that. May nodded, once the way she nodded when a decision was made and she was done deliberating. "Go see what you can see," she said. "Come back and tell me." He was back in 2 hours. She knew before he spoke. She could read it in the way he dismounted, controlled efficient, faster than usual. The way a man moves when he has confirmed what he feared and is already 3 steps into what comes next. "How bad?" she asked. "The upper snowpack broke early," he said. "Warm spell last week softened it, then the freeze came back on top. There's a wall of water coming down the valley." He was already moving, checking his saddlebags, adding ammunition, filling the canteen. "I could see it from the outcrop. Maybe 4 hours out, maybe less." May was already thinking. "The church in Redstone is on the hill." "Yes. If you can get everyone to the church." If they'll listen. He swung back onto Smoke, and the horse shifted with the agitation he was feeling from his rider. They may not. They'll listen, May said. He looked down at her from the saddle. She was standing in the cabin doorway with her hands steady at her sides and her eyes clear, and she looked so completely unlike the woman who had stepped off the train in November with 47 cents and nowhere to go that for a moment the contrast staggered him. He had watched her become this, had been part of how she became this in the same way she had been part of something in him that was changing too slowly and without announcement. "Bar the door tonight if I don't make it back before dark," he said. "Keep the rifle close. Don't open it for anyone you don't know." Cole, he had already turned Smoke. He looked back. "Come back," she said, simply and completely the way she said things she meant. He held her gaze for one moment. Then he rode. She watched him go until the trees took him, and then she went inside and she thought. She thought about the property the way Cole had taught her to think about it, not as a home she lived in, but as a perimeter she was responsible for. She walked the cabin checking things. Rifle by the front door loaded, safety on. Second box of ammunition on the kitchen shelf within easy reach. The axe handle she could reach without looking. The small knife she kept in her apron pocket for vegetable work, which had been there so long it felt like part of her hand. She thought about Dupree, about the bandaged hand she'd noticed when he'd come in December, something that had happened to him somewhere between then and whatever was coming now. About the way he'd looked at the cabin when he left. Not like a man departing, but like a man choosing to return later when the conditions suited him better. She thought about what Cole had shown her after that December visit, the two loose boards on the back porch, the chair position in the kitchen, the angle from the back door that gave you a clear view of the approach without putting you in front of the glass. All of it delivered in as matter-of-fact way information about the property. Nothing more, and all of it, she understood now, information about survival. She positioned herself. She moved the kitchen chair to the spot she'd identified, not visible from the front window with a clear line to the door. She made sure the rifle was where she decided it should be. She checked the back door. She checked every window. She made herself a cup of coffee because there was nothing to do now but wait. And waiting went better with something warm in your hands. The afternoon settled in around her. The cabin creaked in the cold. The chickens made their usual commentary from outside. The creek ran its fast and irregular sound that had been wrong for 3 days and was now the sound of something approaching from far away. She sat and drank her coffee and watched the front window and thought about Eliza Reston choosing her from letters for a man who hadn't known to ask for what he needed, and she thought she was right. "I don't scare easy. I never have." The sun had reached its lowest angle, the light going flat and orange across the snow when she heard the horses. She was at the window in 3 steps, staying back from the glass, angled, so she could see without being clearly visible from outside. 4 of them. Coming up the path from the south, not fast, not the rushing approach of emergency, but the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who believe they have time and intention on their side. Men who arrive slowly because they have decided that speed is no longer necessary. Jack Dupree rode in front. He was a large man who dressed well for a criminal with a good coat and a hat that had cost real money, and the ease in the saddle that comes from years of riding and the certainty that wherever you arrive as the most dangerous thing present. The bandaged hand from December was healed now, replaced by a thin red scar along the back of it. The other 3 she didn't recognize. They had the look of men who took their character from whoever was paying them. She set the coffee cup down carefully and without sound. She picked up the rifle. She breathed the way Cole had taught her to breathe, from the bottom of the lungs, let it out slow. Don't hold it, don't rush it. She moved to her position. She waited. Dupree knocked on the door, pleasantly, the knock of a man calling socially. "Mrs. Reston," he called. "I know you're in there. I saw the smoke from your chimney." A pause. "I have business with your husband. Be easier for everyone if you open the door." May said nothing. "Ma'am." His voice shifted slightly, the pleasantness thinning at its edges, the way paint thins when you have applied it too many times over cheap wood. "I'm going to count to 10. I'd suggest you use the time well." May used the time to move to the front window at an angle that let her see the porch without putting herself in front of the glass. Dupree was on the steps. 2 of his men were hanging back watching the sides of the cabin. The third was moving around toward the back. She heard it the crack of those two loose boards under a man's boot loud as a gunshot in the winter quiet, and it told her exactly where the third man was and that he had half a second before the door. She moved. She crossed the cabin in 4 strides, unlatched the back door, and pulled it open. The man on the back porch had his weight forward toward where he expected the door to be, resisting him, and when it opened instead, he stumbled slightly, just a fraction, just a half step forward into empty air, and in that half step, May put the barrel of the Winchester 6 inches from his face. "Walk back down the steps," she said. Her voice was steady. She was somewhat surprised by this, but also not surprised at all. The man walked back down the steps. He was young, maybe 22, maybe 23, and the calculation that moved across his face was fast and honest. He was looking at a woman who was not shaking and who had a rifle she clearly knew how to hold, and he was deciding whether his wages covered this particular contingency. They didn't. He put his hands up and stepped back into the snow. May stepped onto the back porch, keeping him in sight, and called out clearly, "Mr. Dupree." A pause from the front. "I have your man back here," she said. "His options have narrowed considerably. I'd suggest yours have too." Another pause. She could hear Dupree moving on the front porch, the sound of a man recalculating. "You're going to need to reload eventually," he called back. His voice had changed. The pleasantness was gone now. In its place was something colder and more honest, the voice a man uses when he stops performing and starts simply stating. "I've got 16 rounds," May said. "On. You've got 4 men. The arithmetic favors me." Silence. Then the sound that changed everything, hoofbeats from the south road. Multiple horses coming fast. Not the careful approach of men trying to arrive unannounced, but the direct, urgent approach of men who had nothing to hide about their arrival. Sheriff Aldous Crane rode into the clearing with 3 deputies behind him, and he took in the scene the woman on the back porch with a rifle, the man with his hands up in the snow, and the other 2 men visible around the sides of the cabin, with the experienced efficiency of a man who had been making sense of complicated situations for 30 years. "Jack Dupree," he said. His voice carried the authority of a man who has never once needed to raise it. "Get your hands where I can see them." Dupree's arrest took less than 10 minutes. When it was done and the 4 men were bound and Sheriff Crane's deputies were organizing the horses, Crane came to where May was standing on the back porch. He looked at her for a moment, the rifle in her hands, the steadiness of her, the total absence of the delayed trembling that he might have expected from a woman who just held 4 men at gunpoint. "Cole sent word before he rode for town," Crane said. "Said Dupree might come. Said to watch the south road." He paused. "He also said not to be surprised if you'd already handled most of it yourself by the time I got here." May looked at him. Something about that Cole, having known, having arranged, having trusted her with the knowledge that he'd provided backup without insulting her by making that backup her only option, settled in her chest with a weight that wasn't heavy, more the weight of something solid where before there had been air. "He said that?" she asked. "More or less," Crane said. "In fewer words. You know how he is." She did. She was coming to know exactly how he was. "Is he going to be able to get them out?" she asked. "The people in Redstone." Crane's expression shifted into something honest and not optimistic. "That's what I'm going to go find out," he said. He tipped his hat to her, an old-fashioned gesture, genuine rather than performed, and rode after his deputies. May went inside. She built up the fire. She fed the chickens in the gray late afternoon light, the red hen regarding her with its usual calculating suspicion, and then thinking better of it as it had been doing for months. She collected the eggs with the automatic confidence she'd been practicing since November. She went back inside and sat in Cole's mother's armchair by the fire, and she listened to the creek louder now. Definitively louder, the sound of too much water moving too fast. The sound of a thing that had been building somewhere far away for days and was now very close to arriving. The afternoon went to dusk, and dusk went to the dark of a January evening with no moon. May kept the fire built up. She did not light the lamp. The darkness felt safer than light tonight, and she had learned to trust her instincts about such things. She sat and listened to the creek get louder, and she understood sometime in the wash hours of waiting that what she was hearing was no longer the creek. It was something larger, something that had swallowed the creek whole, something coming down from the mountains with the patience and the absolute indifference of water that has been told to go somewhere and is going there. She sat in Eliza Reston's armchair in Eliza Reston's cabin, and she waited for Cole to come home. The flood hit Redstone at 7:15 in the evening. Cole had been in the streets for 3 hours by then. He had ridden in with the same directness he used for everything straight down Main Street, shouting before he reined in. He had not wasted time on persuasion. He had not apologized for interrupting people's evenings. He had not softened it. He had stated what was coming, what it would do, and what they needed to do before it arrived. Then he had started doing it himself, which was the only argument that had ever really worked with him and proved no less effective now. Some people listened immediately. Families with children moved. First parents have a relationship with urgency that men without children sometimes lose. The hotel owner organized his guests with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for a crisis to be useful in. Warren from the general store had heard Cole's voice and trusted it almost before he'd heard the words. Others required more time, which they didn't have. Nell Vane came out onto the boardwalk of the dry goods store she partly owned and looked at Cole in the street and said, "I will not be ordered about by," and then the sound reached them from the north. That sound, the sound of something that is not thunder and is not a freight train, but is made of the same quality of mass and motion, coming without hesitation, coming without stopping. She stopped speaking. Cole was already moving. He directed people to the church on the hill, the one landmark in Redstone that had been built on high ground by a congregation with the foresight to understand that righteousness and floodplains don't mix well. He moved through the streets with a focus that precluded everything except the next problem, the next person, the next decision. The water came fast and without ceremony. It came the way catastrophe always comes, not at the speed of drama, which is measured and gives you time to feel it, but at the speed of fact, which is instant and total and requires that you act rather than feel. Main Street became a river in less than 90 seconds. The water was brown and cold and full of everything it had collected from 40 miles of mountain valley timber and rock and the accumulated debris of everything that had been in its path. Cole had a rowboat. It was the livery's boat tied to the sidewall, still there, because Pete Garnett had a habit of optimism about flash floods that had not previously been relevant and was now providential. Cole got to it as the water reached his thighs. He got into it as the current took him sideways. He got the oars working before he hit the wall of the hardware store, which was now up to its window frames. He worked the streets for 2 hours. He pulled a young woman from the porch of the hotel, her feet already swept out from under her by the current. He got the Alderson family, 3 children, the oldest 9 years old, off the roof of their house, where they'd retreated when the first floor filled. He reached an elderly man clinging to the top rung of a ladder he'd managed to lash to his chimney, and getting him into the boat with the water at that level and moving at that speed was 20 minutes of work that took everything Cole had. He went back each time. He always went back. At the height of the flood, he saw the light in the second-floor window of the Vane house, which sat lower than most on Main Street, which was now nearly to its eaves in the dark water. He rode toward it. Doyle Vane was standing on the windowsill of his childhood bedroom, a single candle burning behind him, the water below the sill and rising. He was 27 years old, and he had his mother's dark eyes and a face that carried along with the usual marks of age and weather. Something specific and old, and tired, the face of a man who has been carrying a weight long enough that his posture has changed to accommodate it. He looked down at Cole in the boat. Cole looked up at him. 10 years between them in that look. 10 years of silence and debt, and a 17-year-old's terror, and a 24-year-old's decision that had shaped both their lives in ways neither of them had chosen. The water moved around the boat with its terrible, patient indifference. "Jump," Cole said. Doyle jumped. He hit the water hard. Went under, came up gasping. Cole hauled him into the boat with both hands and the last reserves of his strength, and Doyle lay in the bottom of the boat coughing and shaking, and Cole rode toward the church on the hill without a word, because there were no words for this that hadn't already been said by 10 years of silence. The silence had said everything. Now the flood was just confirming it. When they reached the church steps, partially submerged, the water still rising but slowing, Cole helped Doyle up the steps and felt for the first time how badly his ribs hurt. He had taken a timber to his left side an hour ago, working to free a woman whose skirts had caught on a submerged fence post. He had kept going because there had been no alternative to keeping going. Now there was no one left in the water. He had checked. He had gone back until there was no one left. He sat down on the church steps in the cold water and let the exhaustion take him. He woke on a pew inside the church. The smell was candles and wet wool, and the density of many frightened people in an enclosed space beginning very slowly to understand that they had survived. Children were crying with the bewildered release of children who have been held in tension too long. Adults were quieter, which was worse in its way, the silence of people taking inventory, counting what remains. Hattie Briscoe was there moving through the pews with blankets and the practical efficiency of someone who had decided that shock was a luxury and there wasn't time for it. Warren had organized a distribution of what food had been salvaged. Sheriff Crane was in the corner with two of his deputies taking account of who was present and accounting for who wasn't. The count came up right. Everyone was there. Cole lay on the pew and felt his ribs with careful fingers. 3, maybe 4 cracked. His hands had been bleeding and had stopped. His left shoulder was going to be impressive in the morning. He was cold in the way you get cold when you've been in moving water for 2 hours in January, not the surface cold of winter air, but the deep cold that takes up residence in your bones and charges rent. He needed to go home. He needed to know May was all right. He sat up. Hattie Briscoe appeared beside him immediately with a blanket and the expression of someone who was about to have an argument. "You need to stay still," she said. "You've got cracked ribs at minimum, and you nearly—" "Is there a horse I can borrow?" he said. "Cole Reston, if you get on a horse right now—" "Hattie." He said her name the way he said everything direct, asking for understanding rather than permission. "I left my wife alone. I need to go." Hattie held his gaze. She was a woman who understood, without needing it, explained what it meant when a man said a thing the way Cole had just said it. "Pete Garnett's roan is in the church stable," she said. "She's calm and she's fast." She paused. "The road's washed out in 2 places. Go the long way around by the ridge." "I know the way." "I know you do." She put the blanket around his shoulders. "You tell May Calloway that she married the most stubborn man in Wyoming and that I said it first." It took 3 hours. The long way around by the ridge added the distance and the washed road added more, and the roan was good and willing. But she wasn't Smoke, and Cole rode through the darkness with his cracked ribs announcing themselves with every stride, and the January cold finding every wet place in his clothes and making its argument. He rode with the single-pointed focus of a man who has reduced the entire world to one destination and one question. When the cabin clearing came into view through the last of the pines, the cabin intact on its rock foundation, lamplight and in the window seat, the chickens quiet in their coop, the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still night air, he let himself breathe. He had not realized entirely that he had been holding it. Then the door opened and May came out at a run. She crossed the yard in the snow and he barely had time to dismount before she reached him, and then she was there, her hands on his face and his arms, her eyes moving over him fast and cataloging damage the way she cataloged everything thoroughly and without flinching. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm here," he said. "You're hurt and you're here," she said. "We're going to address them in that order." He let her lead him inside. He let her sit him in the armchair and unwrap the wet coat and the shirt beneath it with hands that were steady and careful, and spoke of someone who had learned over 3 months how to handle things that mattered without handling them too hard. She wrapped his ribs with strips of clean cloth from the mending basket, working with the calm efficiency of a woman who had decided that the fear she'd carried for the past several hours was going to have to wait because there was something more immediate to deal with. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him, and something moved through her face, all of it at once, the fear and the relief and the anger, and underneath all of those something larger and quieter that had been building for 3 months without a name. "I handled Dupree," she said. "I know. Crane sent word when I arrived in town. You told him I might not need him. I told him to go anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. "You trusted me to handle it." "Yes." "And you provided backup anyway." "Yes." She stopped. She looked at her hands in her lap, and then she looked back up at him. "Cole, I need to say something." He waited. "I came here with 47 cents and a line and nothing else," she said. "I thought my life was over. I thought I had used up every possibility I had." She paused, choosing words with care. "And you gave me a chance, not from charity, Not from you just gave it to me because you saw something that was real and you responded to what was real. That's who you are. He didn't speak. Your mother knew, May said. She knew exactly who you were. She wrote it in those letters. She said you had your grandfather's stubbornness in her eyes and that you'd spent too many years alone because of reasons that weren't your fault. And you'd convinced yourself they were. She held his gaze steadily. She was right about all of it. And she chose me to come here because she thought I could see it. The real thing underneath everything the town built on top of you. May, I can see it, she said. I have been able to see it since about the third day. I just needed time to be sure of what I was seeing. The fire settled in the grate. Outside the creek was already beginning to quiet the flood's energy, spent the water finding its new level. Cole looked at her for a long time. The pale eyes that the whole town called cold. They were not cold. She knew that now the way she knew the cabin's floor plan in the dark by having moved through it enough times, that it was simply true, a fact as basic as the dimensions of the room. I don't know how to do this, he said. Whatever this is, I've been alone long enough that I don't. I know, May said. I don't entirely either. She reached forward and put her hand over his, over those scarred, calloused, careful hands that had carried everything they'd carried without asking for help. But I think we've both already started. He turned his hand over and held hers. Marry me, he said. Properly, not the arrangement, not the name for protection. He paused, and what came next was said with the directness of a man who has decided that honesty is the only thing he has left that's entirely his own. Because I want to. Because I'd like to spend the rest of my life finding out what you're going to do next. And I'd rather do that as your husband than as the man you made a deal with. May looked at him in the firelight of his mother's cabin. Yes, she said, simply and completely the way she said the things she meant. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, Doyle Vane stood up in the Redstone Church before the congregation gathered to discuss the rebuilding of the lower town, and he told the truth. He told it clearly and without ornamentation, the way a man tells a thing when he has decided that the weight of it has simply become more than he can carry and maintain the other requirements of being alive. He was 27 years old and he looked older, and when he finished speaking, the church was completely silent. He looked at Cole, who was sitting in a pew near the back with May beside him. Cole nodded once. Nell Vane did not speak during the silence. She sat in the front pew with her hands folded in her lap and the composed face she'd worn for 30 years, and behind it something was reorganizing itself. The architecture of a grief that had been directed the wrong way for a decade suddenly required to find a new shape. It did not find that shape quickly or easily. Such things never do. But it began, and beginning is not nothing. She came to the cabin on a February afternoon, rode out herself without announcement, which was its own kind of statement. May answered the door and found her standing on the porch with a package wrapped in brown paper and an expression that was the most unguarded May had seen from her. I owe you both a debt, Nell said. I owe Cole a debt I cannot repay. I owe your mother that letter I can never send. She held out the package. This was my mother's. I wore it when I married Mr. Vane. I'd saved it for something that. She stopped, started again. It should go to someone who's actually earned it. May took the package. Inside was a wedding dress, ivory silk, simple, and beautifully made with small pearl buttons down the back and lace at the collar and cuffs. She held it up. It was going to fit perfectly. She could see that without trying it. Come in, May said. Have coffee. Nell Vane came in. She sat at the table that Eliza Reston had built. She held a cup of coffee in both hands and looked around the cabin. The same cabin she had resented from a distance for years, the cabin of the man she'd blamed for her son's ruin, and she saw what was in it now. The recipe cards, the box of letters on the shelf, the curtains the same gray-blue as May's dress, the mended shirts on their hooks, the 2 cups that had become 2 cups sometime in the past 3 months without either of their owners marking the moment when it happened. She was a good woman, Nell said quietly. Eliza, she was kind to everyone in this town. A long pause. I should have asked what happened to her son, rather than deciding what had happened to him. Cole, who had come in from outside during this and was standing by the door, said nothing. He crossed to the table and sat down and accepted the cup of coffee May put in front of him. He's here now, he said. He's all right. She looked at him. Her dark eyes were the same as her son's, the same shape, the same directness that Doyle had gotten more of from his mother than he probably knew. "I'm glad," Nell said, and she meant it. Whatever she was, whatever she had been, she meant that. The wedding was on the first Saturday of March 1883. The snow had begun to retreat by then, backing up the hillsides inch by inch under the pressure of days that were cold but longer, the sun finally winning more of its argument with the horizon. The world had that clean, raw quality that comes at the end of a hard winter, the sense of things stripped back to their essentials and found to be intact. Still standing, still themselves. The church had been repaired. The lower town was still largely in process. The flood had taken 3 buildings entirely and damaged most of the rest, but the church stood clear and clean on its hill, its white paint fresh, its bell working again after someone had recovered it from the mud downstream and rehung it with the pragmatic optimism that was the most reliable quality of people who chose to live where the weather could still kill you. The whole town came. 6 months ago, Cole Reston had ridden down Main Street and the town had dissolved into its doorways. Now the same town filled the same church to hear him say words to a woman most of them had known for 4 months and already couldn't imagine Redstone without. May dressed in the small room at the back of the church. Hattie Briscoe was there, practical and warm in equal measure, helping with the pearl buttons on the back of Nell Vane's mother's dress. The dress fit the way May had known it would when she'd held it up in the cabin, as though it had been made for her, as though some chain of deliberate choices extending backward through time had been quietly arranging the fit all along. "You look like someone who knows exactly what she's doing," Hattie said. "I know exactly who I'm marrying," May said. "That's close enough." She walked down the aisle alone. She didn't need someone to give her away. She had given herself clearly and of her own will, and everyone in the church understood that. She had walked into harder situations than an aisle with a congregation on each side and a man waiting at the end of it. Cole was at the front of the church in a suit that fit him imperfectly and which he wore with the straight-back dignity of someone who has decided that if something is worth doing, it is worth doing correctly. He had shaved. He had combed his hair. The scar through his left eyebrow caught the morning light coming through the church windows, and his eyes, those pale silver eyes, found her when she was still at the back of the aisle and stayed on her the entire way down. She had spent 4 months learning his face. She could read it now, the way she read the weather, the way she read the creek level, the way she read the morning light to know what the day would be. What was in his face as she walked toward him was something she had suspected for months and was now confirmed, had been confirmed, she thought, looking back somewhere around the second week when he had taught her which plants would kill her with the patience of a man who found the knowledge worth sharing because the person learning it was worth protecting. The minister was brief because Cole had specifically asked him to be. The vows, they said, were the ones the minister provided, old words worn smooth by repetition into the shape of something essential. And then Cole added 2 sentences that he had apparently written himself and the minister hadn't expected, and stepped back slightly to allow. "I promise to be where you can find me," Cole said. "When everything else is uncertain, I will be where you can find me." May looked at him and said, "I promise to stay, not because I have nowhere to go, because there is nowhere I would rather be." The church was very quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't because churches full of people who have survived a winter and a flood and several reckonings of various kinds are not especially inclined to stay quiet when something worth celebrating finishes being said. The celebration afterward was held in the churchyard tables brought out from the adjoining hall, food contributed by everyone who had anything left after the flood, which was less than it might have been, but more than enough. There was music from the fiddle player who lived above the hardware store and dancing and laughter of the kind that comes after hard things have passed and people are remembering what laughter is for. May watched Cole navigate all of it with a kind of wondering disbelief, like a man who has woken up in a country he'd been told didn't exist and is still not entirely certain he's not dreaming. He accepted handshakes that 2 months ago would have been impossible. He answered questions that a year ago would have been asked of no one because no one would have dared. He stood in the middle of the community he had protected and been rejected by, and eventually saved, and he received what it was offering now cautiously, as a man receives something he has wanted so long. He no longer trusts the wanting, but he received it. Hattie Briscoe found May near the end of the afternoon when the light was going gold and the cold was beginning to make its evening argument. "He's going to be all right," Hattie said quietly, nodding toward where Cole stood, talking with Warren and Sheriff Crane. His posture no longer the coiled watchfulness of a man who expects to be attacked, but the simpler stance of a man in a place where he is known. "I know," May said. "You did that?" Hattie said. "His mother did that," May said. "I just showed up." Hattie smiled. "Most of the time, that's all it takes." Near the edge of the crowd, Doyle Vane stood with his mother beside him, both of them watching the celebration with expressions that were complicated and honest, and better May thought than either of them had looked in a very long time. Doyle caught her eye and nodded once, a small, sincere acknowledgement of something that didn't need words and was better without them. May nodded back. "Some debts don't get paid, they get released. The release isn't the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and none of it is the same as being free. But all of it together done honestly moves in the right direction." That was enough. It was more than enough. Late that night, after the celebration had wound down, and the guests had gone home and the churchyard was quiet under the first clear stars of a March night, Cole and May rode back to the cabin together on Smoke, who had come through the flood winter better than almost anything else in the county, being the kind of horse that takes the world as it presents itself and doesn't hold grudges about any of it. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it, warm from the banked coals settled on its rock foundation, the creek running clear and lower now, the right sound, the sound she had fallen asleep to and woken to for 4 months and had already stopped imagining being without. They sat on the porch in the cold. She had the blanket from inside, and Cole had his duster, and they shared the warmth between them, and they looked up at the Wyoming sky, which on a clear March night is not so much a sky as a declaration of the scale of things, all that space and all those stars arranged with the indifference of something that has been doing this far longer than anything else exists. "I keep thinking about November," May said, "standing on that platform with 47 cents. I keep thinking about a woman stepping in front of my horse," Cole said. "Were you angry?" "No." He considered it honestly the way he considered everything. "I was surprised. It had been a while since I'd been surprised." May looked at the stars. "She was right about the solid ground," she said. "Your mother. I needed somewhere to stand. I didn't know that was what I needed until I was standing here." "She was usually right," Cole said. It was one of her more reliable qualities. "She was right about you." He was quiet beside her. "She said you needed someone who wasn't afraid of what you'd become," May said. "She was right. I wasn't afraid of it. I was curious. There was something there that didn't match the story everyone told. I wanted to know what was underneath. And now you know." "Now I know." She turned her head and looked at him, the profile of him in the starlight, the line of his jaw, the scar, the steadiness that she had come to understand was not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of depth of a man who run very deep and has simply never had anywhere safe to bring that depth. "You're a good man, Cole Reston. You have been a good man for a long time in a place where no one was watching and no one would have known the difference." He said nothing for a long time. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient and unhurried arcs. Then, she said in one of the letters she described what she was looking for. She said she wasn't looking for a woman who wanted to be saved. She was looking for one who already knew how to save herself, May said. "I remember." She was right about that too. He turned and looked at her, and in the starlight his eyes were the color they always were, that pale winter silver that people called cold, and that she had known for 4 months was not cold at all. Had never been cold, was simply the color of someone who had learned very early not to let what was warm in him be visible to people who would use it against him. You saved yourself, that night with Dupree, every morning in November when you had nothing, every door that closed in your face. "You gave me somewhere to bring it," May said. "My mother gave you somewhere to bring it. You let me stay." The creek ran its right and clear and ordinary sound behind the cabin. The mountains stood where they always stood, enormous and patient and utterly indifferent to the small human arrangements taking place in their shadow. The cabin behind them held the warmth of a fire that had been banked by hands, that had learned how to do it from the person sitting beside her. "I will always let you stay," Cole said. It was not a declaration. It was a statement of fact in the manner of a man who deals in facts and always has, who has found that facts said clearly and kept carefully are more valuable than any number of beautiful promises. As long as I'm here, there is a place for you to come back to. May pulled the blanket tighter and leaned into the solid warmth of him. Then I'll always come back, she said. The night settled around them, the two of them and the stars and the sound of the creek in the Wyoming winter, finally slowly beginning its long retreat towards spring. The world was cold and large and indifferent and full of floods and frauds and men who would try to take what wasn't theirs and towns that built their monsters and then believed in them hard enough to make them real. And in the middle of all of it, on a rock foundation porch in the high country, two people sat together with the warmth of those who have found against the considerable odds exactly where they were supposed to be. Eliza Reston had known. She had known her pa, and she had studied the letters carefully, and she had made her choice, and she had put a note in a drawer and gone to her rest, hoping the future would be kind enough to honor her intentions. The future had been kind enough. Some things, the best things, the ones worth having, begin with a woman stepping off a train with 47 cents and nowhere to go, and end with two people on a porch looking at the same stars, and the distance between those 2 points is made entirely of choice. The choice to ask, the choice to answer, the choice to stay. And every day after that, the same three choices made again. That was what love was in the end, not the grand gesture, not the dramatic moment, but the daily decision to keep choosing, to keep showing up, to keep the door open. Cole Reston had kept the door open without knowing it for 10 years, and a woman named Eliza had seen it from the other side of the country and sent someone to walk through it. And May Calloway, 26 years old, arriving with nothing, had walked through it and found herself on the other side exactly where she belonged.